And I told Congress, I said, listen, you have the power of the purse. And everybody listening here, hey, this is Congress doing this. They're giving the money without the conditions. If USAID, State Department, and the other 20 federal departments and agencies that get a piece of the foreign aid pie do not disclose who they're going money to, withhold it. Why are you funding South Africa? They're we've given them billions of dollars. South Africa is the point man in Africa for communist China. They are pro-Hamas, and yet we keep on giving them money. They need to be cut off.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Max Primorac, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I had no idea that there were millions upon millions of experts in USAID on the internet. I had no idea that everyone was so invested in this agency of the federal government. Of course, we're kidding. A lot of people are out there in the media, out there on social media, saying that the sky is falling and the world is ending because the Trump administration and DOGE have gone after USAID. You were the acting chief operating officer of USAID in 2020. You have more experience than I think anyone that I know in this particular agency. How did you get to that position, first of all? And then we'll talk about exactly what it actually is rather than the corporate myths about it.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And it took 35 years to get to that situation. I was part of an NGO back in the 1990s when there was a war in former Yugoslavia. That broke up, and did a lot of work there, and came to know USAID operating in the area and already had identified some problematic things, are already supporting a lot of the woke stuff that we see today. Then after 9/11, joined the Bush administration, and was at the State Department. Spent 3 years at Embassy Baghdad overseeing about $2 billion worth of foreign aid programs, mostly run by USAID. Spent some time in Afghanistan on a contract financed by USAID to help build up the subnational government in Afghanistan. And then Trump won, to my delight, shock and delight. And then I joined the agency itself, first to look at some of these billion-dollar operations that we were doing in some of the Middle Eastern countries where we didn't have a presence, and the fear of diversion of aid to terrorism was real. Then I was asked by the vice president to serve as his envoy to Iraq. If you remember, at that time, we had the issue of persecuted Christians who were victims of ISIS genocide. So I went up to the north for about 18 months, and then came back, launched a new bureau, a Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, $9 billion operation, and then finished up as the COO of the organization. So I know it from every single angle you can think of.
And I mentioned the corporate media myths circulating about USAID. Everyone thinks it's just giving food to hungry people and clothes to the unclothed and shelter to the homeless. It's different than that, more than that. Sometimes scarier, more problematic than that. I guess for those of us who haven't been on Twitter claiming that we are USAID experts, what is USAID? What does it do? What is it meant to do?
Well, the organization was founded by JFK, President Kennedy, back in, 1961? Yeah. And it was formed in order to counter the Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviets were trying to spread communism all over the place, Europe, Africa, Latin America, next, close to our shores. And it was used to help countries respond to natural disasters and trying to help them generate economic development to the Soviet and the other communists couldn't take advantage of poverty to try to spread their evil ideology. It played a really good role in Eastern Europe. Remember when communism fell? We had all these countries in Eastern Europe that used to be part of what was called the Warsaw Pact. You're too young to know, but I was about your age.
I do recall. I learned
no
that
way.
in my history
You must
class.
have been a toddler when that happened.
I didn't just learn gender theory in my history classes.
Okay, you had to learn it in school. But I actually was there. I was just finishing up grad school, and it worked. It turned Central and Eastern Europe into really strong allies. Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and others. But then soon after that, unfortunately, you could start seeing the changes going on, and frankly, it's something that the left saw it as an opportunity to wage their culture war, not only on America but on the entire world. So you had President Clinton, but particularly Hillary, that started inserting these sexual reproductive rights, abortion into all of our programming. And then when Obama came in, oh boy, they started really pushing the LGBT issues. The climate ideology started getting into there. When we came in, we were pushing as much of that stuff as we could. The resistance that we faced, quite frankly, the anti-Christian resistance we faced was extraordinary. And then when Joe Biden came in, they went in full force with Samantha Power at the helm. He issued some of the first things that he did as president was issues these directives to tell everybody we're going to use foreign aid to promote DEI, gender fluidity, population control, abortion, climate ideology, and all these crazy ideas. And every nook and cranny was corrupted by it, even food aid. You can imagine folks escaping war or escaping tsunamis or earthquakes. They got only the clothes on their back, and we're giving them food aid. And here's a little a flyer on transgender rights. It just became really crazy. Now, that's not to say that there's a lot of good things that it does. And, emergency aid, there's good stuff there. The infectious disease, we don't want Ebola escaping. I actually had to contain 2 outbreaks of Ebola in Africa, so I know how scary that is. It can really do great things for helping persecuted Christians, but the problem is that everything became corrupted, and that's why the Trump administration has had to do a pause and look at every single of the 20,000 activities to make sure we weren't violating the trust of the American people.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it can do good things.
Yeah.
But this was never understood as a bank for countries who are having a rough go of it. It was never understood as a permanent replacement for civil society, etc. These soft power dynamics were meant to get these nations and get these persecuted minorities in specific countries on their feet, right? This was the development of U.S. interests abroad, of U.S. assets abroad. We've heard a lot from Mike Benz, for example, on Tucker and other shows, talking about how USAID is doing so much more than just providing humanitarian aid. It cultivates all sorts of different assets to advance U.S. interests abroad. The development of those U.S. interests, and maybe you disagree with Mike Benz, but the development of those U.S. assets to advance U.S. interests, has that been something that actually advances the national interest, the interest of the American people, or is it the interest of the Uniparty and the establishment in Washington?
Follow the money. In this town, as you know, it's all about money. When we were in the first Trump administration, our thesis was the purpose of aid is to end the need for it. And that meant helping countries get off, either they had civil war or they had some kind of famines or things like this, and we would move them up the development stage for them to get out. But let's look at. Let me break down into it about the money, because following the money is very important. When I was
just to interrupt you, I mean,
money.
You hear
the money.
You hear about like USAID is coming to an end, and therefore there will no longer be independent media in Iran. Well, like, listen, I'm no friend of the Iranian regime, but if the United States is footing the bill for quote unquote independent media, then that by definition isn't independent, right? So follow the money.
Yeah. Half of it doesn't leave the Washington D.C. Half. So when I was there, our budget was what, $22 billion, and it got in 2023, it got up to like $44 billion. Did more money help reduce poverty? Did more money help reduce hunger? Did more money produce more political stability? The spending is not a strategy. And in Washington, D.C., if you want to solve problems, you got to spend more. In this case, it wasn't. But when you're thinking about 50% of that stays here through overhead, salaries, and things of that sort, and then you start looking at the political sociology of the industry. So in the past few years, being here at the Heritage Foundation, it's given me time to really do the kind of research to just try to dig in and say, what's going on here? Because when I was there, there was a lot of pushback. There was always, give me more money and all of that. So we started looking at political contributions from the Federal Election Committee. Commission, what is it? Committee commission. And when you give a political contribution, you have to put your employer in there, right? That's public information. So we started looking at all political donations from the State Department. We looked at them for USAID. And what did we find? For State Department, it was like 94% went to the left. At USAID, it was like 98% that went to the left. National Endowment for Democracy, like 95% to the left. And then we started looking at all of the partners, the international NGOs, the contractors, and started looking at all of them where the billions and billions are going. And 95, 98%. Even World Vision Catholic Relief Services, the vast majority, well over 90% of the political donations were going to the left. You look at the boards, they're all prominent people making very high salaries. So when you think about what's happened, the left, which was misusing USAID, and they're doing this across the federal government, misusing taxpayer money as a slush fund to finance their own people. And these are folks that can go out there, do the media, be the foot soldiers of the left, give money back. And so you had a one-sided uni-party apparatus here funding only one side of the political equation. And thank you, U.S. taxpayer.
Yeah. We just had Representative Mark Harris from North Carolina on the show talking about DOGE. He's talking about also the FEMA corruption that we saw in the response to the Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. And we started to talk about all the different feedback loops that we're going to start to uncover. So taxpayer money goes in. It is appropriated to an organization or an agency like USAID. That money goes out to some nonprofit, which takes out another chunk, right? So 50% overhead at USAID, then more overhead at the nonprofit where those funds are appropriated. And then that money makes its way back into the political system, into the coffers of Democratic campaigns to ensure the perpetuation of this feedback loop where people get a
what we call that?
Six-figure salaries.
Do you know what that's called?
What is it called?
Corruption.
Yeah.
It's called corruption. It's a patronage system, and we spend so much money to try to end these patronage system all over the world, and yet that same money has been misused to create one here.
And when we look at these feedback loops, you were just in Congress testifying for 5.5 hours about USAID. You called it in your opening statement a highly partisan global vehicle imposing radical social ideas. These aren't just your run-of-the-mill social ideas, right? These are mass population control. PEPFAR, for example, which is a State Department program, but that was a program to focus on combating HIV and AIDS across the world. It's supposedly saved 25 million people from dying of AIDS, which is great. But the Biden administration, for example, overtook that PEPFAR funding and said, we're going to start devoting this to abortion. I mean, this is a very radical population control agenda that the left is pursuing through this stuff.
Well, thanks for bringing up PEPFAR, because this was a project or program that was developed during the Bush administration. It was truly a Christian-driven program, and it did a lot of good. It did save millions of people, but lo and behold, Biden comes in, and there was no secret. He issued the executive orders, the directives from the White House on paper telling everyone you're going to use all of the programs, including PEPFAR, to promote this evil this evil ideology. I was in Kenya and Mozambique last year, and I can't tell you how many people were so upset as to how suddenly they were faced. You're talking about bishops, you're talking about religious leaders, the Catholics, the Anglicans, the evangelicals. They're the people on the ground helping, providing health support, education, business initiatives to try to raise people out of poverty. And then all of a sudden they face this imposition on them that any good that they do, they have to include this kind of evil ideology. And I remember in Mozambique, where it's one of the biggest recipients of PEPFAR, and I saw in an area we're driving through, it's where all the embassies are. It's the elite part of town. It's where the U.S. Embassy and the ambassador lives. And near the ambassador's residence, I see this huge mansion, and it's a contractor that does PEPFAR. Now, on something that's supposed to help the poor, you'd think they'd be located in another part of town, but they're in the most exclusive part of town, right near the ocean front. So it was utterly corrupted. When working with Chris Smith from New Jersey, who was one of the founders, we were able to block a 5-year reauthorization of the program with no changes. We were able to stop this. And so, yeah, it was something to testify in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and seeing Republican after Republican member just exposing what's being done. And I said to all, even to the Democrat members of the committee, I said, look, there's a lot of good things that were done, but it's also been abused. And for the last 3 years, I've been writing, thing after thing, after report saying, you're doing these crazy things. If you lose bipartisan support in Congress and you lose the trust of the American people, you will be shut down. And here we are.
And let's look at what DOGE is doing to USAID. One of the most interesting parts of all this is Elon Musk coming out and saying, we just went to the areas or to the agencies where we saw the most resistance to the executive orders issued by President Trump. That happened to be USAID. If USAID, though it was created by Congress, is part of the executive branch and they're not listening to the president, I mean, who do these people work for? Who do these people think that they work for?
They think they're an independent NGO and that they are outside the need to be responsible to the American people. I remember when I came there was such resistance to help the persecuted Christians, especially in Iraq. They'd come up with stories like, oh, it's against the Establishment Clause. Oh, it's anti-constitutional. Those were all bogus excuses. When I took over the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, it was just after George Floyd was killed, and then you had all these protests. We had about 400 people in just my bureau, probably like about 30% of the workforce, write a letter supporting Black Lives Matter, claiming systemic racism in the agency, which was untrue, and asking that the leadership be replaced with women of color. It was an open rebellion. And they even rebelled against President Biden. Remember the whole thing with Israel and Gaza and opposing Israel. We had 1,000 people in the agency call for an immediate ceasefire and the quick and immediate delivery of humanitarian assistance. They're not politicals. They're not supposed to do that. But if what they were asking is for the president to intervene and prevent Israel from doing the job so Hamas could resurrect itself and continue its campaign of genocide against the Israeli people. That's just how bad it got.
So this is really interesting. There is no lack of funding or jobs at all of these independent NGOs who actually
well, now it's gone. Now it's all gone.
But they ostensibly do the work that these USAID workers wanted to do. Why don't they go work for them? And also, you talked a little bit about how these folks would start to make constitutional arguments when you would come in and say, hey, we need to support religious freedom. We need to help these persecuted Christians. Apparently, I guess if they're making constitutional arguments, they must have read the Constitution. I mean, how do they reconcile these constitutional arguments that they make with their existence as, a pseudo-independent part of the executive branch? Like, I even have a hard time articulating it because it makes zero sense whatsoever. If you are concerned with the constitutional aspect, why do you think you're an independent agency within the executive branch?
Well, these are folks, you know how the left, they don't even consider the Constitution as valid anymore. It needs to be changed because it's an old document. So it's kind of funny for people who probably don't even believe in the validity of the Constitution, claiming the Constitution is a reason not to help Christians. But you're right. The USAID is a contracting agency. What does it do? It spends money. Who does it give the money to? UN agencies, international NGOs, for-profit contractors. That's what it does. And if you look at all of those entities that are receiving money, you're going to see the revolving door. A lot of former people who worked at the agency are now working for them, and it's even worse. It's a haven for some of the most left-wing people in the world. One of the biggest partners for USAID is called the International Rescue Committee, New York-based, called IRC. The president has $1 million salary. He's also, Miliband is also the former foreign minister of the socialists in United Kingdom, and he brought in all his little young socialists to work for him. When I was in the Trump administration, in Trump 1, they were still getting a lot of money, and yet they were constantly suing the president on his efforts to stop illegal migration. So taxpayers were literally financing left-wing organizations led by European Marxists to attack our president's anti-illegal immigration policies. That's just how crazy things got.
Yeah, and DOGE is uncovering all these different contracts. Listen, if you're a USAID worker and you're on the left listening to this show, please go work for those independent NGOs, and then the right people will get into USAID, stop funding the NGO, and then you'll be out of a job yet again.
But the thing is, these independent NGOs, a lot of them depend 100% on the government for their funding.
Exactly.
Which is a kind of an interesting business model that your entire client base is one.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's get into some of the stuff DOGE has found. $45 million to DEI in Burma, $520 million to ESG in Africa, $1.2 billion completely undisclosed, $20 million on Sesame Street in Iraq. Now, I liked Sesame Street growing up as a kid, but the line item there that concerns me most, more than DEI, more than ESG, is the $1.2 billion that were completely undisclosed. How does USAID get away with having a lack of transparency there?
Because it's part of the working culture. There was actually a good audit done by U.S. government Inspector General, and discovered that for about $142 billion of contracts, USAID could not account for how much of that went to overhead. Now, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senator Joni Ernst over on the Senate side, worked really hard in hitting them to get that information. They would not. It took them months and months to release that information. The lack of transparency is because they don't want accountability. One of the things that they're supposed to do that they haven't done, and in the committee I said this is one important way in which you could solve a lot of these problems, is that there should be a consolidated website, a database, where anybody, not just a member of Congress, but the American people who's paying for this, can go in and look, okay, who's getting money for what we're doing in Africa or in Latin America? Who's getting the money? And very importantly, who's getting the sub-awards? Because very often these entities will get, let's say, $100 million, but half of it they'll sub to somebody else. And this is where a lot of the tricky stuff can get in there, where we have a lot of abortion folks can get subs, and there's no, you can't see. So they're supposed to do that already. They don't. And I told Congress, I said, listen, you have the power of the purse. And everybody listening here, hey, this is Congress doing this. They're giving the money without the conditions. If USAID, State Department, and the other 20 federal departments and agencies that get a piece of the foreign aid pie do not disclose who they're going money to, withhold it. And there was also, I said at the end of my opening statement, why are you funding South Africa? They're one of the, we've given them billions of dollars. South Africa is the point man in Africa for communist China. They are pro-Hamas. They are pro-Iran. They sent illegal shipments of weapons to Russia. And yet we keep on giving them billions of dollars. They're the ones who launched the accusation, the war crimes accusation against Israel. And yet we keep on giving them money. They need to be cut off. But it is something that it's not USAID or state. It's the Congress that puts it in there in the legislation. Countries that are not our friends, why are we funding them? That's not counter China, that's counter America.
Yeah, I mean, one of the steepest learning curves that journalists can encounter getting into this business is trying to navigate government websites to track the money and see where it goes. You know this as an expert. On the journalism side, it's much more different. It's much more difficult almost because you don't have that inside knowledge. Okay, I don't, you know what certain code words mean. I don't from the
A lot of code words, yeah.
Right.
It's true.
And that's and this is something that is not just for journalists or not just for scholars and not just for members of Congress and their staff members. This is something that is supposed to be made available for the American people. Right. And they purposefully make these systems super difficult to navigate so that the American people can't hold them accountable. You mentioned the overhead in your testimony. You said $142 billion or something like that was completely unaccounted for in overhead at USAID. We are seeing, I think, this is thankfully or hopefully a nadir in the USAID foreign aid reputation in the American public, right? The hope is that we can fix it and re-legitimize that soft power. And we're also, with that nadir, there is a peak in the nonsense going on. You mentioned in your brief bio at the beginning of the episode that during your time over in Yugoslavia, working in tandem with USAID, you started to see the seeds of all of these different problems that we see on display now with DOGE. What were those seeds?
Well, this is what was shocking to me. It was I was asking the embassy to help finance a conference because it was the 2-year anniversary of 9/11, and I thought it was a good, I did something with a German foundation, and I was supposed to get money, and all of a sudden they cut it off. And at the same time, I saw all these anti-American demonstrations by these green individuals, these extreme women groups, and all of that. And I started going on the internet and looking them up. They're all funded by USAID. So it had started even there, and it's even worse because as I looked at who were the individuals leading them, they were all members of the communist aristocracy. Because at that time, the communists, it was their children and their relatives who could go to the West for universities. They had the nice clothes. They had an opportunity to learn foreign language. And the pro-America opposition, the guys who were the people who were the real pro-democracy activists, didn't have this. So they had really difficulty in engaging with the U.S. government. And we were literally financing the communist aristocracy, and they morphed into all of these left-wing organizations. I'll give you another example today. Here we are more than 20 years later. And I was reading something, I was always tracking what USAID is doing, and then I read what was called a request for proposal. The way it works is the U.S. government issues what's called a request for proposals. We have a program we want to do, and we have this much money to do it. Send us a proposal back, and we'll choose who's the best player. And then I saw one that was called Civil Society, an international civil society program. So I was reading, and they said it's based on the works of a professor such and such. And so I looked at the footnote and I saw the name. So I just thought, hey, who's this professor? I kind of expected it. Marxist professor from Italy. So here we go again. Literally, U.S. taxpayer money was funding a Marxist-inspired program to recreate the left all over the world. Anti-capitalist, anti-NATO, anti-Christian, and anti-American.
Yeah, it's boggles the mind. And you were there.
You couldn't make it up.
Yeah, you couldn't make it up. I mean, it really does sound like something out of a Bond villain plot. And you were there on the ground in Iraq, in Afghanistan, as you're kind of seeing this system that you were concerned about in the late 90s, early 2000s start to mature. And I think one of the things that really changed Americans' opinions on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan people were supportive of making the terrorists pay, and then all of a sudden, mid 2000s, late 2000s, you start to see public opinion change, and that was because we started to see how expensive the war was, not only in human terms, but
Trillions.
trillions from our treasury, and how money that was going to the DOD was going up against money that was being funneled through our foreign aid apparatuses, right? So all of a sudden, there's a funny meme going around with Iron Dome missiles going from one direction and Hamas missiles going from another direction. And on top of the Israeli missiles, it says, "My taxpayer dollars at work."
Yeah.
And then on top of the Hamas missiles, it says, "Also my taxpayer dollars at work?" Question mark.
Yeah.
And we saw that in Iraq and
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
we
It
did.
really changed the public's opinion of the war. I mean, tell us a little bit about your experience seeing U.S. taxpayer dollars on both sides of this conflict and how it just completely muddied the waters.
Well, something that people don't know and hasn't been addressed yet, but I suspect it will soon is, people are familiar with what's happened in Gaza and how humanitarian assistance coming from the United States through these various UN agencies were literally being diverted to Hamas, right? And so we helped literally finance Hamas's genocidal attack on Israel. But it's not only there. In Afghanistan, we've since this catastrophic withdrawal by President Biden, the entire embassy is gone. We have no eyes and ears on the ground. All of our partners that were doing work, they had to leave. All the local Afghan workers that were on the ground delivering humanitarian aid, most of them left. Others were killed because they were working with the infidel. And we're still spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Well, where's the money going? You have in Yemen, the Houthis in the north, in the Red Sea there, attacking our ships constantly. We got almost like $1 billion a year over there. And there's one study that was done to ask people, well, how many of you have seen this aid? It was like 26%. Where did it go? Pompeo in the last administration stopped all aid to Yemen because we knew it was being diverted by the terrorists. In Syria, a report by a more centrist think tank showed that up to 50% of the aid was being taken by one way or another by the Assad regime. So I hate to say this, but we might be the leading funder of international terrorists. This has to stop. It's crazy. And the problem, it's too much money. This is another problem. When you keep pushing more money out, you encourage bureaucrats to spend it faster, irrespective of whether or not they know where it's going. I saw this myself when I launched the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. I saw we didn't have enough contract officers. So I actually put in our internal risk tools, red. And I imposed a vetting system where anybody who touched the money, we had to have their names, and they had to go through databases to see whether or not they're a part of a terrorist group. As soon as the Biden administration came in, they removed all of it.
Yeah, and so you talked a little bit about this more mature system with Hamas, Israel, currently what we're still funding in Afghanistan. But it almost feels like the early days in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was kind of the model that is grown out of it. Funds such like American DOD funds, American foreign aid funds made their way into the hands of individuals in Iraq and Afghanistan that engaged in bachabazi and things of that nature. And if you don't know what bachabazi is, this is a family-friendly show. Look it up on your own time. It's back in those early days. I mean, you're getting your hands around what USAID is. You haven't yet worked, I think, properly with the agency, but you're seeing these little glimpses of how problematic this is.
Look, foreign aid should be a very effective tool of foreign policy, but it also reflects the natural charitable impulse of the American people. Our Judeo-Christian ethic compels us to help those in need. The challenge that Secretary Marco Rubio has is, how do you take that really positive thing and reform something that is so terribly broken? Maybe what they've done is the only way to start. But he's been very clear. We're going to look at everything, things that make sense, that follow, that are aligned with American interests, that are aligned with American values. These are things that we want to continue because that's how we are as a people, but it's also in our national security interests. Unfortunately, so much has been corrupted, but I think they're doing a fantastic job. I'm very confident that at the end of this process, there's this 90-day pause, but they are getting money out for those things that are urgent, and they've been vetted correctly. None of this, they've taken out the radical stuff, that they're going to come up with something that that does align with what the president said. Interests and values, period.
So the future of U.S. soft power, if this is done correctly, you seem very optimistic about this change. I think the American people are very optimistic about it.
There's no soft power without hard power. Soft power only works when it's got hard power behind it.
Right.
It's the credibility. If you don't have hard power behind soft power has absolutely no credibility.
So what does that future look like? This soft power with this, that little carrot and that big stick.
Well,
if the Trump administration does this right.
Well, that day is now. You can see in the president's engagement with even our neighbors who basically have not been following their side of free trade. You see, we have Vice President Vance over in Germany now at this big security conference talking about, yes, we have external enemies, but we have internal enemies where the left is misusing this concept of disinformation and Russia to basically clamp down on the opposition and our basic freedoms. You see the tariffs that he's putting on. He's being tough with all of our adversaries, and people are respecting it. Within that kind of framework, these other kinds of negotiations and soft tools are going to be much more effective because now they know there's a real leader in the White House and he means business. The era of baloney is over.
Max Primorac, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sit-Down.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit-Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.